Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Claire Winslow. This podcast takes a slow, careful look at historical crimes that never reached closure. Not for spectacle, but because examining the gaps often tells us as much about the past as any verdict. No music, just the case. Today's episode focuses on the 1898 Gatton murder, a crime that shocked a small Queensland town at the end of the 19th century, and then, almost as quickly, slipped into the long shadow of the unsolved. Before we begin, a brief note about approach. We follow the documentary record where it exists. Inquest transcripts, police notes, contemporary newspaper reports, and we flag uncertainty where it appears. We'll reconstruct what is on the record and explore the investigative and social context that made solving this case so difficult. We'll also look at the ways later retellings widened the fog around the facts. I want to be clear, this is a victim-centred telling. We will not indulge in gratuitous speculation or lurid detail. The central question is simple and, in its way, quiet. How did one of Australia's most troubling unsolved crimes remain unanswered for more than a century? To discuss the case with me is someone who knows this era of policing and social life better than most. Dr. Thomas Ellery, a criminologist and historian who specialises in late 19th century Australian policing and rural communities. Thomas, thank you for joining Still Answered.
Thank you, Claire. It's a privilege to be here. The Gatton case sits at an intersection of social history and investigative practice in a way that's both fascinating and heartbreaking.
Thomas, before we go into the day-by-day, can you say very briefly why a case like this is worth revisiting now? What does it tell us?
It tells us how policing, community memory, and the press worked, or failed, at a moment when Australia was modernising fast but still relied on rudimentary investigative tools. And, Claire, importantly, it reminds us that the people involved were real, neighbours, parents, young children, not just fodder for mystery.
Exactly. So let's start at the beginning. Segment 1, A Quiet Night in Gatton. Gatton, in the late 1890s, was a small rural town in Queensland. Think of a place where most people knew each other by sight and name. Farming, local trade, a few public houses, a railway line that connected the town to larger centres. Those were the rhythms of life. It was late December 1898. Christmas had just passed. Boxing Day, for many in that community, was a time for socialising, visiting, dances, church gatherings. That night, a local family, recorded in contemporary documents as the Murphy family, made the ordinary decision to attend an evening dance outside the town. I want listeners to picture that ordinary choice: new shoes for a celebration, the map of lanes and paddocks people took by habit, neighbours saying goodnight. This was not some isolated traveller's caravan. It was neighbours doing what neighbours do. The record preserves a small human sketch. The family were local, working in the district. They were not wealthy, not prominent in sensational ways. They were ordinary. The sources are uneven about specific personalities, and where they are, we flag that. But that ordinariness is important. It tells us, in part, why the event felt so impossible and why the loss resonated across community lines.
That's important, Claire. People in small towns in that era moved in a fairly bounded geography. Social life was local, daytime and nighttime routines were well known, and patterns of movement, routes to dances, the locations of paddocks where travelers might stop, those were predictable. That predictability is what makes the case interesting. An attack in that context suggests either someone opportunistic who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or someone who knew the family's habits.
Right. And as we'll see, both of those possibilities were entertained by investigators and townspeople. On that night, the Murphys left town, travelling along familiar lanes with horses and a small cart. The next morning, something terrible was found. Segment 2, Discovery at Dawn. At dawn, the residents who discovered the scene described in the newspapers and later in the inquest a tableau that made clear at once that something had gone terribly wrong. The family was found near their cart, their horses still nearby. Injuries were visible. Rope marks suggested immobilization. There were tracks in the soil. People in Gatton recorded the moment with the kind of astonished, stunned language you see in local papers. Shock, fear, the impulse to try to help.
We should be careful about the contemporaneous language, Claire. Papers of that time often wrote with a mix of compassion and sensational phrasing, but we can place the basic facts with some confidence. The bodies were found near the cart. The horses and cart orientation suggested their movement had stopped suddenly. There were signs of restraint. Those are observations that multiple witnesses reported. Where accounts diverge, and they do, is in fine detail. Exactly what wounds appeared where, or the precise sequence of how the bodies were discovered.
And that divergence matters because the very first hours at a crime scene shape everything that follows. In Gatton, the immediate response included neighbours and curious onlookers, local law enforcement, and later, officials from a higher authority. But the first reactions also led to crowd contamination. People touched things, tracks were confused. Evidence that might have been obvious to someone trained in modern scene preservation was effectively erased by the sheer number of people involved and the absence of cordoning procedures that we take for granted today. To put it plainly, the handling of the bodies and the scene in those crucial hours created gaps that investigators later couldn't fill. That's not to assign blame by modern standards. It's to explain context. At the time, many communities expected neighbours to be part of the response, to check for signs of life, to comfort the family, and that expectation informed how the scene was treated.
Exactly. There was also the issue of delayed communication. The nearest fully equipped police resources were some distance away, and the lines of command between the local constable and higher officials weren't as routine as they are now. An inquest would later note that the scene wasn't examined promptly by the officials who could have documented it in a forensic-minded way. So the mixture of local intervention and delayed formal examination is a repeated theme in late 19th century rural cases.
Which brings us to segment 3, the crime scene under a magnifying glass. Let's lay out, carefully, the concrete pieces of evidence reported at the scene and then the limits of what those pieces can tell us. Multiple reports indicate the family was found near their cart. The horses were still present. Rope marks were observed on the bodies, and there was some evidence of manual strangulation or blunt force. Contemporary papers used such language, though the language varies across accounts. There were footprints and cartwheel marks in the soft ground. Clothing details were noted, garments disturbed, some items found about the area rather than on the bodies. That list, horses, cart, rope marks, tracks, is the forensic skeleton of the case.
But then we have to add the second layer, the limitations of 1890s forensic science. There was no blood typing, no DNA, no routine ballistic analysis as we know it. An inquest could call witnesses and examine wounds. Coroners could describe injuries. Doctors could estimate time of death within a window. But many of the fine-grained questions we want answered today, whose prints were in the mud, whether a rope carried fibers from a particular rope maker, or microscopic transfer evidence, was simply out of reach.
And beyond those technological limits, the sources we have sometimes contradict each other. One local paper might say the rope was found knotted in a particular way. Another paper describes the knot differently. Eyewitnesses gave differing accounts of whether the horses were saddled or simply standing. Those disagreements mean historians have to be cautious. We can say certain things with reasonable confidence. The arrangement suggested restraint and a sudden end to movement. But we can't confidently reconstruct, for example, an exact sequence of wounds or the killer's approach route in terms that would satisfy a modern court.
There's also the question of staging versus control. Some historians have asked whether the scene was arranged to mislead, to suggest a robbery or an opportunistic attack, while others think the scene reflects a perpetrator intent on immobilizing victims quickly. Both are plausible given the rope marks and the proximity of the cart. Both are undermined by the lack of definitive indicators like missing goods or clear signs of forced entry at a homestead. Again, uncertainty.
Let's pause there. Thomas, I'm going to ask you a direct question. Given what we know about that layout, cart, horses, ropes, tracks, what does it suggest to you about the perpetrator's familiarity with the family or the area?
It suggests one of two broad possibilities. Either this was an opportunistic event where the perpetrator encountered the family on a route they used and took advantage of the moment, or it was someone who knew the family's routines and chose a place where they could be isolated. The presence of rope and the apparent restraint suggests some planning or at least preparedness. If you bring a rope, that implies an intention beyond a spontaneous attack. On the other hand, improvised restraint can tell you a perpetrator had to subdue quickly and leave. Different mindsets, different implications.
So we have a scene that suggests restraint and interruption, limited forensic options, and contradictory witness statements. That uncertainty is fertile ground for speculation, which leads us to segment 4, suspicions, rumors, and named suspects. In the immediate aftermath, as is typical, Gatton filled with speculation. Neighbours whispered about grudges, past altercations, and persons seen in odd places. Newspapers printed every whisper they could verify with a named source. Some rumours pointed to local feuds. Others suggested passing travellers or itinerant workers. Some contemporaneous articles named individuals who were questioned by police, though being questioned then is not the same as being charged, and, importantly, few of those early lines of inquiry led to prosecutions.
It's important to distinguish between named suspects who had tangible links and those who were simply persons of interest because of opportunity or reputation. In small towns, reputation matters. Difficult, solitary people, or those with known grudges can quickly become objects of suspicion, and the press at the time loved to highlight personality conflicts. From an analytic perspective, you have to weigh motive, means, and opportunity carefully. Motive might be hypothesized. Jealousy, debt, revenge, but without more concrete corroboration, it's speculation.
Exactly. There are a few individuals who appear repeatedly in the record, people who were questioned, whose alibis were tested, or who appeared in newspaper reportage as having had an argument with a member of the family at some earlier time. I'll be clear. The documentary record contains names and interrogation notes, but the record also contains contradictions about those alibis, and crucially, no one was ever charged in a way that led to conviction. That's a vital point.
It's also worth remembering that the inquest system then could be blunt. An inquest might publicly name people as suspicious or even impugn reputations without the safeguards a modern criminal trial would impose. That public naming, true or not, could harden community perceptions and later retellings.
And those hardened perceptions feed into the next segment, an investigation in the dark. Let's walk through how the official side of this unfolded and where key missteps occurred. After the discovery, local constables took statements and the coroner held an inquest. But there were jurisdictional and logistical issues. The resources to properly process the scene had to be summoned, and when they arrived, much of the scene had already been disturbed. Witnesses gave varying statements that the police recorded, but records show inconsistencies in dates and times, not necessarily conspiratorial, but a reflection of chaotic early hours. The inquest concluded with a formal cause of death and recorded the facts it could, but it did not produce a suspect sufficiently supported to secure a prosecution.
There are several themes that keep showing up in cases like this. One is the expectation that local people will do the legwork before higher authorities arrive. Another is the bandwidth problem. Small-town constables had multiple duties and limited investigative training. Then there's the effect of media pressure. Newspapers demanded answers and sometimes pushed sensational angles. That combination can encourage investigators to focus on suspects who fit a narrative, rather than following the more tedious work of establishing timelines and corroboration.
And there's the issue of lost or incomplete records. Over time, some files survive, some don't. In the Gatton case, what we have are inquest notes, coronial findings, press reportage, and later historical accounts. Some original police reports are fragmented. That patchiness makes reconstructing the investigators' reasoning challenging. We can say they did what they could, given the norms and tools of the time, and also that those norms and tools were inadequate in key ways for a homicide investigation.
Right. Also, modern viewers sometimes underestimate a simple fact. Forensic science was not a silver bullet even when it existed. Proper scene recording, witness cross-checking, and persistent follow-up were as decisive then as now. In Gatton, the combined effect of scene contamination, rushed public expectation, and limited follow-up created a space where leads cooled quickly.
As a result, the files and community memory split into multiple theories, none conclusive. That takes us to segment 6, theories that refuse to fade. Over the years, several major theories have been proposed to explain what happened that night. I'll outline the main ones, and Thomas, I want you to help evaluate what weight each can reasonably bear. Theory 1, a lone, opportunistic killer. The core claim here is simple. Someone encountered the family on the road and, perhaps for robbery or some fleeting motive, attacked. Evidence supporting this includes the absence, at least in some reports, of premeditated planning signs. There were no clear targeted messages in the scene. Evidence against it includes the presence of rope and restraint, which, as you said, suggests someone who came prepared to control victims rather than acting purely spontaneously.
Opportunistic attack is always a tempting explanation in rural settings, especially if robberies or violent confrontations happened occasionally on isolated roads. The problem is that if robbery was the motive, you'd expect clear signs of ransacking or missing valuables, and the record is equivocal on that point. If it wasn't robbery, what motive explains killing 3 people? That lacuna weakens the purely opportunistic hypothesis.
Theory 2. Someone known to the victims, a personal motive. People in the town suggested grudge or resentment. Supporters of this perspective point to known disputes recorded in local papers or inquest testimony, and to the idea that the perpetrator would have been familiar enough with the family's routine to strike when they'd be isolated. The counter-argument is the lack of firm corroboration. While rumours of disputes existed, there's no conclusive evidence that a person with motive and opportunity acted.
Behaviourally, perpetrators who know their victims can act with a degree of intimacy. They may choose a place where nobody will intervene, or they may aim to silence witnesses. However, such cases often leave a trail of interpersonal conflict or threats that, with sufficient archival digging, become visible. In Gatton, the trail is faint and scattered, so the known person theory remains plausible but unproven.
Theory 3. A travelling or serial offender. Across Australia and beyond, the late 19th century did have itinerant labourers, teamsters and travellers. A few historians have speculated that someone passing through could have committed the crime and then moved on. The support for this is circumstantial. The mobility of people at the time, the avenues for movement by rail and road. The weakness is similar. No strong physical or testimonial evidence ties an outsider to the crime, and there's no verified pattern of similar attacks nearby.
Serial offenders leave patterns, similar victimology, similar modus operandi, similar geographic markers. Gatton has none of that obvious pattern. A travelling offender remains a possible scenario, but again it's not strongly evidenced. And in that era, traveller could be a catch-all label applied when communities couldn't explain an event.
Lastly, more complex conspiracy theories have circulated. Multiple people involved, or cover-ups to protect someone of social standing. These theories often arise in the vacuum where straightforward explanations fail. They can be compelling narratively, but from an evidentiary standpoint, they are hard to sustain. You need corroborating records of collusion or of official interference. In Gatton, those kinds of records are absent, though rumours persisted.
Conspiracy explanations can obscure rather than illuminate. They sometimes persist because they fill emotional or psychological needs in a community, a desire for someone visibly to be accountable. From an historian's point of view, absent documentary proof of collusion, they remain speculative.
So, when we place these theories side by side, we find recurring limitations, motivational gaps, inconsistent witness testimony, and a degraded physical record. That doesn't exonerate the investigative authorities of the time from criticism, but it does clarify why no single theory ever achieved the standard of proof required for conviction. Segment 7. Echoes across a century. How has the Gatton murder lived on in memory? Gatton occupies a particular place in local history. It has been retold in newspapers, in regional histories, and in true crime books that sometimes conflate fact and legend. Later historians have tried to untangle those threads, re-examining inquest documents and contemporaneous reporting to separate contemporary fact from later embellishment.
One notable shift is how modern forensic understanding reframes the evidence. Where contemporaries might have emphasized sensational elements, modern readers notice the absence of preservable evidence and the high likelihood of contamination. If this case were discovered today with the same initial mishandling, we'd be skeptical about our ability to reach a definitive conclusion. That modern lens both highlights the tragedy and cautions us against assuming a neat answer exists.
A second echo is ethical. Revisiting cases like Gatton affects living descendants. Some local families carry memories and oral histories that colour how they view the past. As researchers, we have a responsibility to handle those narratives carefully, to acknowledge the pain without recasting the dead as props in an exotic tale.
There have been occasional calls to re-examine the case with modern techniques, but practical obstacles remain. The physical evidence, ropes, clothing, the cart, if preserved, would be prime candidates for modern testing. But much of that material was lost, destroyed, or never archived in a way that would survive a century. Even if something survived, chain of custody questions and degradation make modern testing difficult. It's a common frustration in historical cold cases.
Let's be specific about what could help, hypothetically. If preserved materials existed, fibres from ropes, fabric with bloodstains, or hairs, modern DNA analysis could assign profiles and possibly link to a descendant's genetic tree. Ballistics wouldn't apply here, but trace evidence and isotopic analysis of fibres or soils might situate objects geographically. None of that is available in a usable form for Gatton, at least as far as surviving records indicate.
And even if something did survive, ethical and legal considerations apply. Exhumations, for example, are complex and require family consent and legal authority. Researchers must balance the potential knowledge gains against the intrusion on families. The duty to the living matters as much as the duty to historical truth.
Segment 8. What we still don't know. This is the painful but honest part. What are the critical, unanswered questions? First, who was responsible? The file doesn't contain a name that rises to the level of reasonable certainty. We have persons of interest, inconsistent alibis, and folk memory, but nothing to meet criminal or historical standards of proof. Second, motive. Whether the act was robbery, revenge, sexual violence, or something else is unclear. The physical scene hints at restraint, but restraint alone doesn't give motive. Missing goods are not consistently reported. Threats or threats received by the family are reported as rumours more often than documented facts.
Third, was this planned or opportunistic? There are indicators for both interpretations. The rope suggests preparation. The lack of a clear pattern suggests opportunism. Again, a clean answer isn't supportable.
Fourth, the evidence preservation. Which items, if any, survive in archives? Some documents remain in public record collections, but many physical artifacts do not. That loss severely limits modern re-examination. Finally, were there investigators who knew more than they reported? The records don't indicate an obvious cover-up, but the gaps in documentation leave space where we can't be sure. I'll say this plainly. With Gatton, historians and investigators must live with uncertainty. It's uncomfortable, But it's also more honest than forcing a tidy explanation.
And the final point is methodological. Asking the right questions matters as much as finding answers. If one approaches historical unsolved cases with the humility that evidence is incomplete, the work becomes about weighing probabilities and acknowledging limits, rather than declaring a final truth where none exists.
That brings us to our last segment, closing the file, for now. Thomas, any final reflections on what Gatton teaches us about justice and memory?
It teaches us that community trust in institutions matters enormously. The people of Gatton in 1898 expected local systems to protect them and to investigate seriously when that trust was breached. When the system couldn't produce answers, it left a wound in the public imagination. For modern listeners, it also teaches patience and the obligation to remember victims as people rather than mysteries.
For me, the case underscores the ethical dimension of telling old stories. We retell because unanswered cases remind us of the human cost of investigative limits. We retell because remembering the victims is itself a kind of justice, even if the legal system failed to deliver closure. Before we close, a few practical notes. If you're interested in primary sources, the inquest transcripts and contemporary newspapers are held in regional archives and some digitised collections. Read them with an eye for contradictions and with the caveat that press language often reflected editorial aims of the time. If you feel compelled to dig deeper, consider partnering with an archivist or a historian. Approaching family descendants directly without context can be harmful, and we have a duty of care.
And if any listeners are thinking about solving this case as a weekend project, please pause and consider the responsibilities involved. Historical research can help, but it can also reopen wounds. Work with professionals and community groups.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank you to listeners for spending this time with a case that resists closure. The Gatton murder is a reminder that the past sometimes keeps its secrets, and that the honest work is often slow and inconclusive. Still, the act of examining, carefully, critically, and respectfully matters. If you found this episode useful, please consider subscribing to Still Unanswered. We'll be back with another case that refuses easy answers. In the next episode, we'll look at another late Victorian mystery, a disappearance that exposed the limits of municipal policing in a different state. For now, I'm Claire Winslow. Good night.
Good night, Claire, and thank you to everyone listening.